What if one simple act of kindness could change your entire life? Jake Carter, a struggling single father, was just days away from losing everything: his home, his hope, his future. But on a rainy morning, he made a choice to help a stranger in need, expecting nothing in return. What he didn't know was that the woman he helped was a billionaire, and his small act of kindness would change both their lives forever. This is the story of how generosity, integrity, and unexpected second chances can rewrite destiny. Stay tuned for an incredible journey of resilience and the power of doing good. Subscribe now to TH Voices of the Underdog, where real stories of struggle and triumph come to life. The morning was heavy with the kind of rain that soaked through even the thickest of coats. Droplets pounded against the cracked pavement of Chicago's streets, forming puddles that reflected the dim glow of streetlights. The wind howled between the towering buildings, sending a chill deep into the bones of those forced to endure the elements. Jake Carter hunched his shoulders against the cold, pulling his worn-out jacket tighter around his body as he pushed forward. His 6-year-old daughter, Lily, bounced beside him, completely unbothered by the miserable weather. She laughed as her pink rain boots splashed through the puddles, her golden curls sticking to her forehead. Jake stole a glance at her, feeling an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. She deserves better than this. For months, he had been searching for work, applying to every job he could find, but the rejection emails kept piling up. Employers wanted someone younger, someone with more specialized experience, someone with a more recent work history. None of them wanted a former mechanic who had spent the last 6 years juggling odd jobs just to provide for his daughter. Today was his last chance. A potential job opening at a local auto repair shop had come up, and though it wasn't much, it was something. A stable paycheck, a way to keep the lights on, a way to make sure Lily never had to go to bed hungry. But he was already at a disadvantage. They were walking because his truck had run out of gas 2 days ago. The last few dollars in his wallet had gone toward groceries for Lily, and after today, there was nothing left. His fingers brushed against the folded eviction notice tucked deep in his pocket. 5 days. That was all the time he had before he and Lily would be forced to leave their tiny apartment, with nowhere to go. The weight of that reality pressed down on him like an unbearable burden. "Look, Daddy, a rainbow," Lily giggled, pointing at the distorted reflection of a neon sign shimmering in a puddle. Jake forced a smile. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." Lily had always been his source of light. She had no idea how bad things were. To her, this was just another adventure, a fun walk in the rain. She didn't understand why her father stayed up late at night, staring at the overdue bills on the kitchen table. She didn't notice how thin he had gotten, how he always made sure she ate first, even when there wasn't enough for both of them. All she knew was that Daddy loved her, and that was enough for her. But it wasn't enough for Jake. He wanted more for her, a stable home, a childhood filled with laughter and warmth, not hunger and uncertainty. As they reached the bus stop, Jake checked his watch. 8:30 a.m. The interview was at 9:00 a.m. and the shop was a 30-minute walk away. If the bus didn't come soon, they'd have to start running. He sighed and glanced at Lily. She shouldn't have to go through this. Jake sat down on the edge of the bus stop bench, rubbing his face with calloused hands. He felt the sting of exhaustion settle deep in his bones. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in weeks, his mind constantly racing with worry. What if he didn't get the job? What if the landlord refused to give them more time? What if he failed Lily? The thought alone made his stomach twist with anxiety. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't let that happen. Lily climbed onto the bench beside him, her tiny hand reaching for his. "Are we gonna be okay, Daddy?" Jake swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. Lying had never come naturally to him, but for her, he would do it. "Of course, baby. We always find a way, don't we?" She nodded enthusiastically, completely believing him. "Yeah, like that time we had a picnic in the living room because the power went out. That was fun." Jake chuckled softly. She didn't know that the power outage had really been the electricity getting shut off because he couldn't pay the bill. Lily's innocence was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The bus never came. Jake checked his watch again. 8:40 a.m. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. With a sigh, he stood up, taking Lily's hand. "Come on, sweetheart. We're gonna have to walk the rest of the way." She didn't complain. She never did. They walked in silence, the sound of raindrops hitting the pavement filling the space between them. The city around them moved in a blur, people rushing to work, cars honking, umbrellas bobbing down the sidewalks. Jake barely noticed any of it. His mind was too preoccupied with what he would say in the interview, how he would convince the manager to take a chance on him. As they turned onto a quieter street, something caught Lily's attention. "Daddy, look." That lady looked sad. Jake followed her gaze and spotted a sleek black Bentley pulled over to the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking. Beside it, a woman stood holding a phone, looking frustrated as she paced back and forth under a flimsy umbrella. Jake hesitated. He was already running late. He couldn't afford to waste time. But then Lily tugged at his hand, her big blue eyes filled with concern. "She looks cold. Maybe we can help," Jake sighed. He knew that look. Lily had always been kind to everyone, always quick to offer help even when they had nothing to give. For a moment he considered walking away. But then he saw it. The way the woman shivered, the way she kept checking her watch anxiously. She was stuck, and he knew exactly what that felt like. Jake exhaled slowly, pushing his worries aside. The interview could wait. He squeezed Lily's hand. "All right, kiddo, let's go see if we can help." With that, they crossed the street, completely unaware that this simple decision was about to change their lives forever. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle as Jake and Lily turned onto a quieter street, away from the bustling city traffic. The air was thick with the scent of wet pavement, and puddles glistened under the dim morning light. Jake, focused on reaching the repair shop in time for his interview, barely noticed the silence surrounding them, until Lily suddenly tugged on his hand. "Daddy, look," she said, pointing ahead. Jake followed her gaze and spotted a sleek black Bentley parked awkwardly on the roadside, its hazard lights blinking in rhythmic flashes. The car was pristine, a stark contrast to the cracked pavement and worn-down storefronts lining the street. Beside it stood a woman, dressed elegantly in a tailored navy blue coat and heels that were clearly not meant for wet sidewalks. She was holding a phone to her ear, but the frustration on her face was unmistakable. Every few seconds, she checked her watch, shifting uncomfortably under a flimsy umbrella that did little to shield her from the rain. Jake barely spared her a glance. They didn't have time for this. He was already cutting it close, and stopping now could cost him the job opportunity he so desperately needed. But then, Lily spoke again, softly but with certainty. "She looks really sad, Daddy. Can we help her?" Jake hesitated. He knew that helping her meant risking his future. But then he glanced at Lily, her blue eyes filled with innocent concern, and he felt something in his chest tighten. She had always been that way, kind, selfless. Even when they had nothing, she always wanted to share. Jake sighed. He couldn't ignore her. "All right, kiddo," he murmured. "Let's go see if we can help." Lily beamed as they crossed the street, her little hand gripping his tightly. The woman noticed them approaching and immediately stiffened, her expression shifting from frustration to mild suspicion. She clutched her phone tighter, clearly wary of strangers. Jake understood the hesitation. A man in worn-out clothes and muddy boots wasn't exactly the type of person she was used to dealing with. Still, He stopped a few feet away and raised a hand in greeting. "Having some trouble?" The woman blinked, as if unsure whether to acknowledge him. Up close, Jake could see that she was older than he'd first assumed, probably in her late 40s with high cheekbones and a sharp gaze that suggested she was used to being in control. "Yes," she said carefully. "Flat tire. I called roadside assistance, but they said it could take over an hour, and I'm late for a meeting." Jake glanced at the Bentley's front left tire. Sure enough, it was completely deflated. He had changed hundreds of tires before. It would take him less than 15 minutes. "I can fix it for you," he offered. "No need to wait." The woman hesitated, eyeing him skeptically. "Are you a mechanic?" "Used to be," Jake replied simply. "Worked in a shop for years before." He stopped himself. She didn't need to hear his life story. "Let's just say I've done this 100 times before." The woman still looked uncertain, but another glance at her watch seemed to make up her mind. She exhaled sharply. "All right, if you're sure." Jake nodded and immediately crouched down to assess the situation. As Jake worked, Lily took it upon herself to keep the woman company. She stood beside her, holding the umbrella over her father while chatting away as if they had known each other forever. "My daddy's really good at fixing things," she chirped. "He used to work in a shop, but now he doesn't have a job." Jake froze for a second before continuing to loosen the lug nuts. "And we're about to lose our house," Lily added, completely oblivious to how shocking that statement was. Jake clenched his jaw but said nothing. He didn't want her pity. The woman, who had been distractedly scrolling through her phone, stopped abruptly. She turned her gaze to Lily, her expression unreadable. For a moment she didn't say anything. Then, instead of responding, she simply looked back toward Jake, this time noticing things she hadn't before. His hands, rough and calloused, stained with grease even after all this time. His jacket, patched at the elbows, barely thick enough for the cold. His boots, old and worn, soaked through from the rain. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as if thinking better of whatever she was about to say. Instead, she just watched in silence as Jake swiftly finished replacing the tire. Jake wiped his hands on his jeans and stood up. "All set," he said, stepping back. The woman pulled out her wallet and, without hesitation, retrieved a crisp $500 bill. She held it out to him. "Here," she said, "for your trouble." Jake stared at the money, then shook his head. "No need," he said simply, "just happy to help." The woman frowned. "That's a lot of work to do for free." Jake shrugged. "Kindness doesn't have a price." For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The wealthy woman in her expensive coat and the struggling father in his threadbare clothes. Two people from completely different worlds. And yet, in that moment, something shifted in the woman's expression. She tucked the money back into her wallet. "At least let me give you a ride," she offered. "You're soaked." Jake hesitated, glancing down at Lily, who was now shivering slightly. "We're headed to an interview, actually," he admitted. The woman's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Then all the more reason. Hop in." Reluctantly, Jake agreed. He didn't know it yet, but this single decision was about to change his life forever. As he lifted Lily into the car, the woman pulled out her phone again, this time not to check messages, but to type something quickly into her notes. And as Jake settled into the passenger seat, she cast one final glance at him through the rearview mirror, this time with an expression of quiet contemplation. The office smelled like fresh coffee and ink from a printer that hummed quietly in the background. The walls were lined with faded certificates and plaques that boasted years of service in the automotive industry. Jake sat stiffly in the chair across from a middle-aged man in a pressed suit, his palms slightly damp from nerves. This was it, his last shot. The manager, a bald man with wire-rimmed glasses, glanced down at Jake's resume. He had barely asked any questions, only nodding occasionally as he read. Jake cleared his throat. "I've worked on cars my whole life," he began. "I know engines inside and out, transmissions, suspension, electrical, everything. If you give me a chance, I won't let you down." The manager exhaled through his nose, setting the paper aside. "Your experience is impressive," he admitted, but Jake's stomach clenched. He knew what was coming. "We're looking for someone with leadership experience, someone who's managed a shop before." Jake sat back, his shoulders sinking. "I've led teams before," he insisted. "I trained new hires, handled difficult repairs, dealt with customers." The manager shook his head. "That's different from running an entire repair center." He leaned forward, folding his hands. "I'm sorry, but you're just not the right fit for this role." Jake swallowed hard. His mouth felt dry. Not the right fit. What about the fact that he needed this? What about the fact that he had a 6-year-old daughter depending on him? For a brief second, he thought about telling the man everything, about how he was days away from losing his home, how he had no backup plan, how this job meant more to him than the manager could possibly understand. But he didn't. He clenched his jaw, stood up, and shook the man's hand. "Thanks for your time," he said, voice tight. Then he walked out. By the time Jake reached his apartment, the rain had stopped, but the cold air still bit at his skin. His shoes were soaked through, his fingers numb. He trudged up the creaky stairs, every step feeling heavier than the last. Inside, the apartment was silent. Lily was at their neighbor's place for the afternoon, giving him time for the interview. He should be grateful for that. At least she wouldn't have to see him like this. He walked straight to the kitchen table, where the eviction notice lay exactly where he had left it that morning. 5 days left. He let out a slow breath and sat down, rubbing his temples. For months, he had held on to hope, telling himself that things would turn around, that he just needed to keep pushing, keep trying. But now it felt like the world was caving in. Jake ran a hand over his face, pressing his fingers into his eyes, willing himself not to fall apart. He had to figure something out, he had to. Then his phone rang. Jake stared at the screen. Unknown number, his heart pounded. It could be another rejection, a debt collector, someone with more bad news. He almost didn't answer, but something, a whisper of instinct maybe, made him pick up. "Hello," a pause, then, "Jake, this is Evelyn Monroe. Do you remember me?" Jake froze. He pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the screen like he'd misheard. Evelyn Monroe, the woman with the Bentley, the woman he had helped on the side of the road. The name sounded familiar in a way that made his pulse quicken, and then it hit him. Evelyn Monroe wasn't just some wealthy woman with car trouble. She was one of the richest women in Chicago, the CEO of Monroe Motors, a billionaire. His grip on the phone tightened. Yes," he managed. "I remember." She chuckled softly, as if amused by his reaction. "I've been thinking about what you said that day," she continued, "and I did a little digging." Jake's stomach twisted. Digging? What did that mean? "I looked into your background," Evelyn continued. "You were a lead mechanic at one of the best shops in the city before they shut down. You have a solid reputation. You're hardworking, skilled." Jake swallowed hard. "And you have integrity," she interrupted, "which to me is just as important as skill." Jake barely breathed as she continued. "My company is opening a new branch for high-end automotive repairs. We need a technical supervisor to oversee the operations. Someone who understands cars, someone who knows how to train a team and problem solve." She paused. "I'd like to offer you the job." Silence. For a long moment, Jake couldn't move. He couldn't think. Had he heard that right? Had Evelyn Monroe, the billionaire CEO, just offered him a job? His first instinct was disbelief. "Why me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Evelyn didn't hesitate. "Because I need someone who isn't just talented, but someone who does the right thing even when there's nothing in it for them. That's rare, and I saw that in you." Jake blinked. His hands were trembling. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. He had spent months being told he wasn't good enough, that he didn't have enough experience, that he didn't fit what companies were looking for. And now, just because he had helped a stranger on a rainy morning, his entire life was about to change. Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to gather his thoughts. This is a huge job," he said slowly. "I don't know if I'm—" "You are," Evelyn cut in. "You just need someone to take a chance on you." Jake closed his eyes, his heart pounding. For the first time in a long time, it felt like the universe was finally giving him a break. And suddenly, he realized he wasn't going to lose Lily's home. He wasn't going to fail her. He took a deep breath. "When do I start?" Jake's hand trembled as he set the phone down on the kitchen table. His mind struggled to process the magnitude of what had just happened. A high-paying job, full benefits, a future he could actually rely on. It was almost too much to believe. And then there was the other part, the part that made his chest tighten with a strange mix of relief, disbelief, and overwhelming gratitude. Evelyn Monroe had set up a scholarship fund for Lily. A future he had never dared to dream for his daughter was now suddenly within reach. No more nights lying awake, wondering how he would give her opportunities he never had. No more silent prayers that somehow, someway, she wouldn't be limited by the same financial burdens that had weighed him down his whole life. Now, Lily's future was secured. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead with a shaky hand. "How the hell did this happen?" he muttered to himself. He had spent months knocking on doors, hoping someone would take a chance on him. Every rejection, every closed opportunity had chipped away at his confidence. Yet one small act of kindness, helping a stranger change a tire, had rewritten his entire life. It felt unreal, but it was real, and he had to tell Lily. Without another thought, Jake grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. He nearly slipped on the wet stairs as he jogged up to the neighbor's apartment, where Mrs. Reynolds had been watching Lily during the interview. The elderly woman opened the door before he even knocked. "She's in the living room," she said with a warm smile. "Drawing as usual." Jake barely nodded his thanks before stepping inside. There she was, his little girl, sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a rainbow of crayons and loose sheets of paper. She was humming softly to herself, focused intently on a drawing. When she noticed him, her face lit up like the morning sun. "Daddy," she chirped, scrambling to her feet and running straight into his arms. Jake caught her easily, pressing a kiss against her soft curls. He held her a little longer than usual, squeezing his eyes shut as the weight of everything hit him at once. He had almost failed her. Almost. She leaned back, smiling up at him. "How was your interview?" Jake let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. "I got a different job," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A better one." Lily's eyes widened. "Really? Really?" She squealed, clapping her hands. "I knew you could do it." Jake chuckled, his chest tightening. If only she knew just how close they had been to losing everything. Then he crouched down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "I have something else to tell you." Lily tilted her head. "What is it?" Jake took a deep breath. He had no idea how to say this, how to explain what a miracle this was. "You're going to go to college one day," he said gently. "Any school you want, and you won't have to worry about how to pay for it." Lily blinked. "Like the fancy ones on TV." "Exactly like that." Her brows furrowed. "But don't those cost a lot of money?" Jake nodded. "They do. But someone very kind is making sure you never have to worry about it." Lily was silent for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Why?" Jake felt his throat tighten. How could he explain this to her? How could he make her understand that this wasn't just about luck? This was about the universe finally giving them a break. Because you deserve it. Because you're the most amazing kid in the world. Because for once someone saw us, not as people who were struggling, but as people who deserved a chance. Instead, he simply pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her tiny frame. "Because sometimes," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "good things happen to good people." That night after dinner, Jake sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the eviction notice. Only this time, it didn't feel like a death sentence. Tomorrow he would call the landlord. He would tell him that the rent would be paid, that they weren't going anywhere. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was drowning. A knock on the door startled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, Mrs. Reynolds stood there, holding a steaming mug of tea. "Thought you might need this," she said warmly. Jake chuckled, accepting it. "Thanks." She studied him for a moment. "You look different," he frowned. "Different how?" She smiled knowingly. "Like a man who finally caught a break." Jake let out a breathy laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah," he admitted. "Something like that." Mrs. Reynolds patted his arm before heading back to her apartment. As he closed the door, a new realization settled over him. This wasn't just about the job. It wasn't just about the money. It was about hope. For so long he had believed that life only took from him, that no matter how hard he fought, he would always end up losing. But now, for the first time in a long time, life had finally given something back. And all because he had stopped to help someone. Jake sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had spent so much time believing that kindness was something you gave without expecting anything in return. And while that was still true, he realized now that sometimes kindness found its way back to you in the most unexpected ways. As he stood up to check on Lily, he made a quiet promise to himself. No matter what happened next, he would never stop being the man who chose to help. Because at the end of the day, kindness didn't have a price. But its impact, that was priceless. A month had passed since Jake Carter received the phone call that changed his life. 30 days ago, he had sat in his tiny kitchen, staring at an eviction notice, convinced that his life was falling apart. He had been unemployed, broke, and desperate. Now, everything was different. He woke up every morning with purpose. He had a job, a real job, one that paid well, one that gave him security. He had been promoted from a struggling mechanic to a technical supervisor at Monroe Motors' newest high-end repair center. His name was stitched into his uniform, a badge of honor for someone who had spent so long feeling like a nobody. And Lily, his sweet, innocent Lily, was thriving. For the first time in as long as he could remember, she was waking up excited for the day ahead. She had friends at the company's childcare center, a warm meal every day, and a life that no longer felt like a constant struggle. Jake still couldn't quite believe it. All of this, because of one small act of kindness. Jake parked his once rusted but now fully repaired truck in front of the Monroe Motors facility. Just seeing the company's name on the sleek glass doors made him pause for a second. He still wasn't used to this, to being part of something so professional, so successful. As he walked through the massive repair center, the sound of machinery humming and tools clinking against steel filled the air. His team was already at work, lifting luxury cars onto hydraulic platforms, running diagnostics and fine-tuning engines worth more than his old apartment. Before, he had spent years working in rundown shops, fixing broken-down sedans with second-hand parts. Now, he was overseeing the repair and maintenance of vehicles that only the wealthiest people in Chicago could afford. It was surreal. "Hey, boss," one of the younger mechanics, Andre, called out, wiping his hands on a rag. "We got a Bentley in Bay 3, needs a full diagnostic." Jake smirked. "A Bentley, huh? Funny how life works." Andre frowned. "What do you mean?" Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Never mind, I'll take a look." He wasn't about to explain how a Bentley with a flat tire had changed his entire life. Across town, Lily was having the time of her life. The Monroe Motors child care facility was nothing like the cramped babysitter's apartment she had been left at before. Here, she had toys, books, games, and even a small art studio. And she had friends, other kids whose parents worked for the company. "Miss Harper," she said one day to her teacher, her tiny hands covered in blue paint, "I think I'm going to build a car when I grow up." Miss Harper smiled. "Oh, what kind of car?" Lily thought about it for a second, then said proudly, "A flying one. That way me and my daddy can go anywhere we want." Miss Harper laughed. "That's a great dream, Lily." And for the first time in her life, Lily knew she had the chance to make it come true, because now she had something she had never had before: stability. And she had a future. That evening, Jake finished his shift exhausted but happy. He had spent the entire day bouncing between his crew, troubleshooting issues, training the new hires, and making sure everything ran smoothly. For the first time in years, he wasn't counting down the hours until his shift was over. He actually enjoyed what he was doing. He stepped outside, stretching his sore muscles. The air was cool, the city lights flickering in the distance. Then he saw it. A small piece of paper tucked under his windshield wiper. His heart skipped a beat. For a brief second, his old instincts kicked in. Was it a parking ticket? A bill? Some kind of bad news? But when he pulled the note free and unfolded it, his breath caught in his throat. The message was handwritten, simple but powerful. "Kindness is free, but its impact is priceless. Thank you for reminding me of that." Evelyn Monroe. Jake stood there for a long moment, the words sinking in. He looked up at the sky, blinking against the emotion rising in his chest. For the first time in a very, very long time, he wasn't worried about the future. For the first time in years, he felt something he had nearly forgotten: hope. He slid into his truck, gripping the steering wheel for a moment. It was incredible, really, how one simple decision, one small act of kindness, had set off a chain reaction that had completely transformed his life. He had helped a woman on the side of the road, expecting nothing in return. And in doing so, he had unknowingly rewritten his entire future. He glanced at the note one last time before tucking it into the glove compartment. He wasn't going to throw it away. It was a reminder that goodness still existed in the world, that one small act could make a difference, that sometimes, when life seemed the darkest, a little kindness could bring back the light. As he pulled out of the parking lot, heading to pick up Lily, a small smile tugged at his lips. His life had changed forever. But the lesson he had learned, that would stay with him forever. Because if there was one thing he knew for certain now, it was this: kindness had the power to change lives, and one day he would get the chance to pay it forward.